Good evening. I'm David McCain, the CEO of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Foundation. And on behalf of my foundation colleagues and the library's director, Tom Putnam, I'd like to thank you for coming this evening. I encourage all of you, if you are not already, to become members of the library. I also encourage you to go to our website at jfklibrary.org to learn more about upcoming forums, new exhibits, and activities surrounding the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's inauguration. Particular thanks go to the friends and institutions that make these forums possible: Bank of America, the lead sponsor of the Kennedy Library Forum Series, as well as Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, and the Boston Foundation, along with our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, WBUR, and NECN. Our forums are rebroadcast on WBUR, NECN, and the WGBH Forum Network. Today's discussion is a timely one. The United States Senate is currently pondering the New START Treaty, the product of the first arms negotiations with Russia in nearly a decade. At the moment, it's unclear whether or not there will be a vote on ratification of the treaty during the so-called lame duck session. Let me just paraphrase an article in the Washington Post this morning about the ramifications of failing to ratify the New START Treaty. No more cooperation with Russia on Iran, a setback for progressive tendencies in Russia, new hurdles for Russian membership in the World Trade Organization, a terrible example for nuclear countries such as China and India, slim prospects for better NATO relations, and to top it off, the United States and Russian presidents will look ridiculous. Opposition to the treaty is all the more puzzling, given the fact, as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton recently said, America's entire military leadership, as well as 6 former Secretaries of State, 5 former Secretaries of Defense, 3 former National Security Advisors, and 7 commanders of the U.S. Strategic Command support this treaty and support it now. Sometimes you wonder, is anybody paying attention? Because the world has now lived with nuclear weapons for so many years, and because the Cold War is over, there is, I believe, something of a complacency about the nuclear threat. But no one should be complacent, because make no mistake about it, the threat exists. The START Treaty aside, there are thousands of nuclear weapons in the world today, spread among many nations. The danger, of course, is that somehow, someday, a terrorist organization or a terrorist state will either obtain or develop a nuclear weapons capability. To discuss these and other issues surrounding nuclear disarmament, we have an extraordinary panel this evening. We are honored to have with us tonight Her Majesty Queen Noor. Born Lisa Najib Halaby, she received her BA in Architecture and Urban Planning from Princeton University. Queen Noor currently chairs the King Hussein Foundation and the King Hussein Foundation International, which she founded in 1999 to build on her late husband's humanitarian vision. She is a commissioner of the International Commission on Missing Persons, a board member of Refugees International, an expert advisor to the United Nations, as well as an advisor to numerous other international organizations. She is also a founding leader of Global Zero, an international movement working for the worldwide elimination of nuclear weapons. She represented Global Zero at the historic 2009 UN Security Council meeting, which endorsed the goals of Global Zero, and she was an advisor to this year's Countdown to Zero, a documentary about the escalating global nuclear arms threat. And if that isn't enough, her family has a connection to this library. Her father, Najib Halaby, was appointed by President Kennedy to head the Federal Aviation Association in 1961. Jonathan Schell is the author of 13 books, including his 1982 book on the peril of nuclear weapons, The Fate of the Earth, which received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the National Critics Award. He was a staff writer at The New Yorker for many years, a columnist for Newsday, and a fellow at the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics and the Shorenstein Center for Media. Since 1998, he has been a senior fellow at the Nation Institute and a correspondent for The Nation magazine. His recent articles on the nuclear question have appeared in The Nation, Foreign Affairs, and Harper's, of which he's a contributing editor. Our moderator this evening is Graham Allison, the founding dean of the Kennedy School of Government and now the director of the school's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He's also the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government. His book, Nuclear Terrorism, The Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe, is now in its third printing and was selected by the New York Times as one of the 100 most notable books of 2004. Please join me in welcoming Her Majesty Queen Noor, Jonathan Schell, and Graham Allison. Thank you.
I got lost on the sequencing of things today. It is an enormous privilege and pleasure to be here tonight, and I thank the library for inviting me to visit and to choose a topic that I thought would be of interest to all of you, and then for enabling me to participate with two such articulate and passionate and knowledgeable experts on the subject that brings us here together tonight. That is a particular privilege, and I'm very humbled, actually, to be in their presence. I have come to this issue well, actually, not entirely, in part by way of President Kennedy and the spirit of his administration that infused me and so many of my generation. I was in middle school in Washington, D.C. during his administration, with that sense of optimism and idealism and responsibility to serve. He was one of my early heroes alongside Martin Luther King and Sergeant Shriver, who founded the Peace Corps, and that became my goal as a young girl to join the Peace Corps. And that's the period during which my social and political consciousness developed. And so it makes this a very special moment for me to be here in the building that honors and keeps alive his memory and spirit and extraordinary contributions to this country and to the world. I look at the historic steps towards zero of the past few years from the perspectives of my U.S.-based childhood under the terrifying shadow of the shameful images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the mad policy of mutually assured destruction, but also through the past 35 years of my life and work in the developing world, and also as a Muslim and a mother. For me, as a global citizen, that horror is compounded today by the growing threats of proliferation and nuclear terrorism, which are increasing the odds of what President Kennedy warned about in a very important speech to the United Nations, where he expressed his commitment, his realization, his understanding, and his commitment to working for a world without nuclear weapons. And I see the potential for continuing and expanding what are already irrational arms races in regions like the Middle East and East Asia, increasing insecurity in those regions and eating up absolutely desperately needed human development resources, especially now when so many populations in those regions are under severe economic pressures and the destabilizing consequences of climate change. I believe we're at a nuclear tipping point, beyond which there may be no turning back. And yet at the same time, we're witnessing the greatest opportunity in decades to mobilize what international polling shows us is majority support in nuclear and non-nuclear states for zero. As a Muslim, just to add, I share the moral and spiritual concerns about the genocidal role of nuclear weapons, first expressed by the scientists who created them and witnessed the horror of their destructive impact and were the first advocates for what we're talking about tonight. The Holy Quran declares that killing an innocent is tantamount, one innocent life, tantamount to killing all of mankind. Well, we know that terrorists are trying to buy, build, or steal a bomb, and that there's enough highly enriched uranium in the world today to build more than 100,000 bombs. We believe in global zero. The only way to eliminate the threat of nuclear terrorism is to drain that swamp. And arsenals have already been reduced from their Cold War high of 70,000 to the 23,000 in the world today. So that's a fact that many people don't realize, and that sets a precedent that should not be ignored. Right now at Global Zero, we're working to ensure the ratification of the New START Treaty by the U.S. Senate. And that we'll discuss later, and I don't think there's any need for me to go into that in detail. We also, over the past few years since we launched Global Zero, the movement has grown to 300 leaders, former heads of state, national security advisors, defense ministers, military commanders from the nuclear states as well as some non-nuclear states, and hundreds of thousands of citizens worldwide. Our commission has developed a step-by-step plan for eliminating, that shows how nuclear weapons could be eliminated within 2 decades. In any case, lays out the steps to elimination. We've generated a great deal of media coverage, and we've produced Countdown to Zero, a major theatrical film on the nuclear threat with the team behind An Inconvenient Truth. I think I'll leave it at there, and we will engage in further discussion. But as a founding leader of Global Zero, it is, again, an enormous privilege to be here with the how did you describe yourself, Jonathan? You were there at the birth. You were the birth. You were the birthing agent for Global Zero, and with Allison, whose career and commitment to this cause.
That's too much, but I had my hand in.
So, thank you all for being here with us today, for engaging in this discussion, and thank you to the library for in making it possible and for bringing everyone together tonight. So, sorry. I was thinking of it.
Let's see where it stops.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't know how far this was coming down, and we didn't mean to be part of this scene. There's a new film that's been created by the producer of The Inconvenient Truth, the movie about climate for which Al Gore and effort was awarded the Nobel Prize. And it's called Countdown to Zero. It's just now coming out, and so we're going to see, I think, just a 2-minute clip from this film that ends with the JFK speech that Her Majesty referred to. So if this works, we'll see.
We estimate that there are about 23,000 nuclear weapons in the world.
Various groups have been focused on acquiring weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons.
All the black market seizures that I'm
in the early 19th.
Iran, North Korea, they are prepared to start trading nuclear weapons technology.
The objective of Al-Qaeda is to, quote, kill 4 million Americans. You're not going to get to kill 4 million people by hijacking airplanes and crashing them into buildings.
The United States launched a rocket from Norway to study the Northern Lights. We told the Russians that we were going to launch that rocket, but somebody in Moscow forgot to pass word on it.
The Russians actually opened up the command and control launch codes, the button, put it on the desk, and said, "We're under attack." Fortunately, Yeltsin wasn't drunk, and he didn't believe what the military was telling him.
Highly enriched uranium is now within the grasp of any country.
It doesn't take a Manhattan Project to make a bomb.
We've got to ensure that never once do terrorists succeed in detonating a nuclear weapon.
All of the forces on launch-ready alert could kill over 100 million Russians and Americans within 30 minutes.
I state with conviction America's commitment to seek a world without nuclear weapons.
Would it not be better to do away with them entirely?
The optimum number is none.
None.
We'd be better off without them. I say zero.
No nuclear weapons.
Zero. Zero nuclear weapons. None.
The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
Can I just add one thing on the film?
Please.
It has already been released in 85 cities in the United States. I think it's come to Boston. And it will be released on DVD on the 23rd of November. Great Christmas present, and something that should be circulated as widely as possible.
Good advertisement. I think that as a film device for capturing so much complexity, the producer or producers, Bender and
Lawrence Bender and
Lucy Walker did an extraordinary job. And while you can say, well, okay, it could be a little longer here or a little less there, it's a very engaging video. So I second the Queen's suggestion. Let me go from the film for a second, though. You were involved, I think, as a consultant or helping them with respect to it. So I'd be interested in both what you and Jonathan would say about the film in itself as a way of getting into this topic.
Well, maybe Jonathan would like to begin. I brought an international perspective to the film, and that's where I advised on various ways of looking at where the big picture is concerned, how it might be, how we could make this film resonate as effectively and compellingly as possible in many different nuclear states, not just for an American audience. So that is where I focused but you, Jonathan, probably could address the bigger picture on the film.
Well, I really wasn't very much involved, to tell you the truth. But I think the way I see it is that it's an attempt to add a missing piece to the puzzle. There's one wonderful development that's occurred really in the last 6 or 7 years, and no small thanks to Global Zero, and that is that the officials who were involved with the nuclear question during the Cold War and thereafter, especially those who are out of office, unfortunately, have almost unanimously embraced the idea of going to zero nuclear weapons, to a nuclear weapon-free world. Now, that's something that's absolutely new. During the Cold War, and really for the first decade thereafter, you faced a kind of steel wall of resistance from those folks. And to me, this movie reflects that wonderful change. And to me, it's like a door opening. But the missing piece in the puzzle is public involvement. Because really, since the end of the Cold War, it kind of plummeted. And so the opportunity appeared. And now we have this advocacy by the people who have been most involved with the issue as officials and so on. But we don't have the public involvement. And I think that the movie really has taken a giant step in the direction of seeding that or bringing it about. I'm very much encouraged to see how many people we have here this evening in that respect, too, I may say.
Well, let me pick up from there because it certainly is a often observed point that Jonathan and I have talked about often, that if you ask about nuclear weapons, I mean, if on the Harvard campus you say nuclear weapons, people think, oh, wait a minute, that was what the Cold War was about. Cold War ended before I was born, if you're a freshman. So what is it why is this still a subject? Now, those of us who study the subject know that even though the Cold War ended, Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, the physical objects, which are nuclear bombs, or the material from which you can make nuclear bombs, like highly enriched uranium and plutonium, have half-lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of years. So they don't just go away. But in terms of public consciousness, I think it is correct that mostly this topic is not very vivid. So you've thought a lot about that. Whoa.
Well, yes, because I grew up actually as a young child. We went through, and I don't know how many of you in the audience here remember Duck and Cover, and I was at school in California at the time, and I was ducking under a rickety wooden desk, and that was supposed to protect me from nuclear holocausts, you know, between the United States and Russia. But that was terrifying to grow up with. I mean, that's something that didn't leave me for a very, very, very long time. But the present generation of young people who are, for example, we have student chapters now around the United States and one at Harvard and in other countries throughout the world that are expanding at a reasonably fast rate right now. And the students that are seeing this film are quite stunned. First of all, as you said, they're not aware, they haven't been aware, there hasn't been discussion really since the 1980s about this issue. It hasn't been front and center as it should be. It's become much more complex and much more dangerous over the years since 1945. They can't quite believe we haven't addressed it. And at the same time, what's very heartening is that they are becoming very they're very anxious to engage in this and to use their voices and to help mobilize others in their communities to get involved as well. Because, as you said, the key is public opinion. And it's not only in this country, but the film we're going to take and have already taken to some of the other nuclear states, it's public opinion in all the nuclear states. It has to support in some cases, the courageous decisions that leaders already are committed to, but need the grassroots support for, or to turn the mindset of leaders that have used nuclear weapons as status symbols to support their own domestic credibility, or under the guise of necessary security to secure their states against neighboring hostile states, which is an argument that is really a fallacy, and perhaps the two of you can develop that further.
What about the public dimension of it, then?
Why don't you go first?
No, go, please.
I think it's a very peculiar situation that's arisen, and we're in the 65th year of the nuclear age, and I think we developed the conviction during the Cold War that it was really kind of a two-power thing. I like to say that for that period it wore a two-power disguise. But in actuality, really the destined shape of this dilemma was that knowledge of how to build nuclear weapons was going to be available to all. The scientists back in 1945 understood that and said so. And that, of course, is nuclear proliferation, conceivably going beyond states, even to terrorist groups. So I think that this new underlying reality, which is really, in a sense, a deeper reality of the nuclear age than the Cold War was, is beginning to surface now. We're beginning to see it. And I think, and Graham has written as eloquently as anyone on this subject, and I think this movie picks up the story too. And so it's kind of like something that's just poking its nose up from underwater again. And people are beginning to see it and beginning to react. But we have to encompass and grasp what this new shape is. We just can't go on with the old Cold War rhetoric and so on. We have to see what it is today. and how it's approaching us, which is really from some new avenues, some new directions.
Well, I'll offer at least, I mean, I struggle with this, and I think during the Cold War, it was such a vivid reality that there might be a war that would kill us all. And so that was, as I grew up in college and I worked in the Defense Department or otherwise, I mean, we were genuinely, could feel the possibility. And President Kennedy, if we go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, had a confrontation with Khrushchev over missiles in Cuba, which President Kennedy, thought had a 1 in 3 chance of going to nuclear war. So the people who lived through that experience in the government, both the American government and the Soviet government, never got over it. That is, they had felt, as Khrushchev said, the sense of nuclear burning in the air. That idea, I saw Senator Lugar, the wonderful former Republican chairman of the Armed Services Committee recently, and he said, I was asking him, what about New START and how do things look, and we were going back and forth. And he said, well, it's amazing. I go to Indiana, I'm there for 3 weeks. No one asks me about New START. No one asks me about nuclear weapons. I talk to my colleagues in the Senate, and they say, citizens are not interested in this. You're the one that asked me about this, not, the fellow at the Kiwanis Club or the person whom I'm going to her house to have a coffee, or the constituents. So I think that I applaud very much the film as a way to try to raise consciousness, but I still don't think that somehow it's broken through sufficiently. And I think that's one that requires a lot more imagination. And that's why I think it's so exciting for somebody like you to, be taking a really serious interest in raising consciousness about it.
We screened the film at the Cannes Film Festival among a variety of locations this year. And an old friend of mine was there, George Lucas, and I was tapping his experience. How could we ensure that, what would he suggest in order for us to get this film out and widely circulated? And his response is one that reflects the belief of a number of different experts, which is it's not whether a dirty bomb is going to go off in a major city, likely in either the United States or in Europe, but it could be anywhere. It's just a question of when. And his comment to me was, you're really not going to make progress on this until the first dirty bomb goes off. Now, infused as I was by the spirit of President Kennedy and so many others, as I mentioned earlier, I am devoting myself to trying to minimize the likelihood that a dirty bomb will go off, even though I understand the perspective of those who feel it's inevitable, and that is the moment at which we will mobilize. But it will also have devastating repercussions in terms of the psyche of people in every country of the world, and in the and an impact on the kind of world we live in, what the nature of our societies would be after something like that would take place. So we have to work to prevent it occurring, I believe, and that's why I'm involved.
Well, President Obama gets this issue, I would say. Feels it. So I don't know, again, for the audience, how much you've tracked the conversation, but when he first got a chance to give a speech in Europe, this back in April of 2009, he was going to talk to NATO in Prague, and he said he's going to talk about nuclear weapons. And his staff told him, don't talk about nuclear weapons in April in Prague. The Europeans are worried about a financial meltdown. There's climate, there's 100 issues. And he said, no, it's my speech, I'm trying to talk about nuclear weapons. He then got a chance in September of 2009 to go to the UN, as leaders go every year. And it just happened that the U.S. was the chair of the Security Council. So he said, well, we're going to talk about nuclear weapons. And he said, forget about it. He's not going to talk about nuclear weapons at the Security Council. You're in the midst of a financial crisis. This is September of 2009. This is not the topic. He said, nope, I'm in charge, so that's what we're going to do. Last April, he had this nuclear security summit, the first ever gathering of heads of state on a single topic, namely the security of all nuclear weapons and materials to make sure we don't see just one nuclear bomb explode in a city. And in the biggest gathering of heads of state at the invitation of an American president since FDR invited people to San Francisco for what became the UN. Okay, so he's investing in this topic. So there's on the one hand. On the other hand, a treaty, the New START Treaty, which David referred to in the introduction, which is a modest reduction, not dramatic, not significantly different from the trend line that goes right from President Kennedy and President Reagan when we began trying to limit and then basically reduce the number of nuclear arms, is struggling for life in the U.S. Senate. So how much sense can this make? I mean, I don't want to be discouraging on a Friday night, but it doesn't seem encouraging. So what's encouraging here?
Well, there are lots of encouraging things. You mentioned that we have a president who's committed the United States to a world free of nuclear weapons. That's a very big deal. If you ask the public, how would you like to get rid of nuclear weapons? 75% say yes. I don't think they care a lot about it, but they do say yes. So there's no big roadblock. And I was mentioning before the majority of retired officials, I think all of current as well as former secretaries of state and defense have signed up for a world free of nuclear weapons, not to speak of supporting the START agreement. And yet, and this is what's so mysterious, and I have to say that the more decades that I think about this issue, the more mysterious it becomes to me. I feel as if the longer I go, the less I know about it. To wit, how is it that in 2010, this very modest, absolutely commonsensical treaty that simply takes a few steps along a path that has been blazed since President Kennedy may not pass in the Senate? Let me give you another example. There are about something fewer than 100 tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Now, those are weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons. Those were weapons that were put there to prevent a Soviet attack upon NATO forces in Western Europe. Well, last time I looked, the Cold War was over and the Soviet Union wasn't there anymore. So this is a remnant, a strange sort of shadow that's left over from the Cold War. And yet, today in NATO, there's a meeting in NATO, and the early reports are that they will be unable to withdraw those tactical nuclear weapons. What I'm trying to say here is that for all the positive energy that does now exist in favor of cutting back and reducing and eliminating nuclear weapons, that they are incredibly tenaciously dug into our world. They have a sort of momentum that seems to sort of proceed from the weapons themselves, almost as if human beings were irrelevant. I don't know where that comes from. Maybe Queen Noor or Graham will have some thoughts about why they're so deeply dug in. The Cold War can end, but the arsenals that we've built up for the Cold War just sail on into the future, into what I call a sort of policy-free zone. Why is that? I don't know. So there are positive things, but there's some mysterious momentum or inertia there that's getting in the way.
Well, also the other side of the coin of what you all have been saying is that President Obama has had a partner in President Medvedev throughout this period of time. And so they've made joint commitments, and of course the START Treaty is a joint treaty, but it was preceded by joint statements and commitments that have been reiterated time and time again. The history of the START Treaty is a nonpartisan history, as has been referenced by mentioning Kennedy, Reagan, President Herbert Walker Bush, and it has nonpartisan or bipartisan.
Yeah,
Bipartisan support. That's how it passed through the first committee of the Senate. So I think that is important. I can't speak to the history of the psychology of man well enough to answer that question. But one book, American Prometheus, is a wonderful book about the beginning and about Oppenheimer and the other scientists and the mentality, the struggle that was at play that is today, really, within the U.S. government. And it's quite extraordinary, as you have both said, that we keep repeating history. And what is different today, as you all have already heard, is that not only are there 9 states and the potential for more proliferation among states, but there are these non-state actors that the film made reference to, or the trailer did, non-state actors who are poised to, who are trying very hard to acquire weapons-grade material that is not well secured in many parts of the world. And then you have states like Pakistan, where competing forces for control of Pakistan have said they will use the nuclear arsenal of Pakistan to hit the United States. They've actually said that, and these are not forces to be dismissed lightly. So both within states that have arsenals, but also among these non-state actors, and there's quite a chilling image in Countdown to Zero of a former Soviet, a citizen of a former Soviet state trying to sell HEU to people that he believes represent or are members of a terrorist organization that would use this highly enriched uranium for devastating purposes. He is trying to sell this. He is poor, and at the same time, his greatest aspiration in life is to have a Lamborghini. And this is just one snapshot of what is going on that you can imagine. You can see what motivates people who might well have access to these poorly stored materials in the former Soviet Union and possibly elsewhere. And the only way, as I said earlier, is to drain the swamp if we want to protect ourselves from the use of those materials by non-state actors. So it's not just a question, and these states the nuclear states are beginning to accept that in fact nuclear weapons make them less secure than in fact providing security.
So again, just another footnote on the film. One of the nicest artistic elements in the film for me was the photos of Oppenheimer, who was really the mastermind for the first American nuclear bomb, and then who became haunted by what he had done. And there's a fantastic set of pictures that just sort of recur from time to time in the film, one of which was in that clip that was the very black and white image that you saw. But let me go back to because I think, this is a little bit like listening to the choir in the sense that here are 3 people that agree
we'll have to work up
much more substantially than
you and I used to disagree.
Than we disagree. Well,
maybe we could work up some of our old disagreements to entertain the audience.
I'll try to stir a
you
little.
Could stir.
I think if we're trying to get a better understanding of why anybody could disagree with the proposition that's being argued, so I'll be like the devil's advocate for a minute and pick up on one part that Jonathan wrote about in his first book on the topic, which is one of the big obstacles, obviously, to getting to zero. There's a half dozen ones, but let's just talk about this one specifically, is what you wrote about in 1982. Excuse me, we've already learned how to make nuclear weapons. We can't disinvent this. We can't forget how to make nuclear weapons. So if we can't disinvent nuclear weapons, then somebody, even if we eliminated all nuclear weapons, could make another nuclear weapon. So how many nuclear weapons is too many? According to Zero, the argument is 1 is too many. Okay? So 0 is the right number. Well, then the question is, well, okay, if we're at 0 today, how many days away are we from 1? Or if 1 is not the right number, 10 or 20. So when I worry about this problem, I think we have to recognize your proposition that, well, we can't disinvent nuclear weapons. So people will then know how to make nuclear weapons. So then somebody might actually make more nuclear weapons, even if all nuclear weapons were eliminated. So then if the person who might, or if the party who might make nuclear weapons is one that's threatening to me, then I need to think about whether I need to be ready to make nuclear weapons too on a timetable that's not too far off of their timetable. So maybe I should. So, Jonathan, how to disinvent nuclear weapons?
Well, you can't, of course. Just the other day I coined a very ugly phrase, but that's fine because the whole nuclear subject is full of ugly phrases. And this one is the undisinventability of nuclear weapons. Very, very ugly.
It's translated into German and it works great.
Yeah, it's a very Germanic one. Right. I have to restrain myself from giving an overlong answer here because this is a question that I've given a lot of thought to. It's perfectly true that you can't disinvent nuclear weapons, and therefore it's perfectly true that a world without them is under threat of their return from a cheater, and what people call that is breakout. But what I came to believe pretty soon after writing that book that Graham mentioned is that what people are forgetting is that if it comes to that, those who are threatened by a nuclear weapon also have that same ability. It's undisinventable for them too. And so when you actually look at what the balance of forces are at 0, it doesn't turn out that it's just one country that's going to pop up with a nuclear weapon and start ruling the world. That country is, in very short order, probably going to face other nuclear powers, and not to mention the mass conventional might of the world. And so I like to speak of weaponless deterrence, that is, deterrence that still survives at 0 as one component of what's there. In other words, it's not such a big watershed as it looks like when the last piece of hardware is disassembled. And actually, when you think about it, it turns out that 0 can be nothing other, technically speaking at least, than some technical arrangement whereby you've driven it back a certain point. Maybe you've gotten rid of all nuclear weapon material. Maybe you've just pulled apart the weapons and put their components in different places. But there's no absolute 0 in technical terms. The only way you can get to what I would call an absolute 0 is a political decision. That's a really illegal matter, that you say that these are banned and that their production, not only their use, but their production, would be a crime against humanity for any purpose whatsoever. But that's a stage beyond what might serve as a kind of interim 0 on the way to this sort of deeper political absolute 0. I hope that makes sense and wasn't too long.
Isn't all that speculation better than 9 states and perhaps more with nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that's exactly right. That's the comparison that people often fail to make. They speak as if you could just weigh the merits and demerits of a world without nuclear weapons without comparing it to our current world, which is one of spreading technical know-how, as we've already discussed. And we're sort of at a point at the nuclear age, which was baked into the cake from the very beginning, when it was going to spread even beyond states to groups that are not states, and with all the terrors that flow from that. So you have to compare our existing and the immediate and near future of our current path with the admitted dangers that do persist in a world without nuclear weapons.
Let me push one. I'd say absolutely. And what you said, I understand, and I think that's a strong part of the argument. But let's imagine Stalin. So he had no problem killing 25 million Russians. So the fact that he's a law, or that he has a treaty, or that he's agreed to do something, or that he would have to do something dastardly, that's his business. Okay, so that's not a problem for him. So now, in a world in which there were nuclear weapons had been eliminated, and I at least have to ask myself, how many days, weeks, months away from enough nuclear weapons to make a significant difference in terms of the threat to me about by when he gets there and when I might get there, what's his timeline? So let's imagine I think, well, and how do I even know what his timeline is? But if I think it's weeks, months, should I then be prepared? Just what you said. So okay, so I say, okay, let's us be prepared. We know we have only benign intentions. But of course, he may suspect us of having malign intentions. So he watches what we're doing.
He was a very suspicious guy.
He was very suspicious, and maybe even with some grounding in some cases. Okay, so he watches. So Jonathan is playing the American hand. Stalin is watching him, and he says, "Could you think he could be getting started today?" Well, he might. So maybe we should just get started to be sure we don't fall behind, because we don't want him to get there before I do, or vice versa. So at least in political science theory or security studies, this is called the risk of instability that comes from offense dominance, because if I get there first, I just declare to you, you're not going any further, and if you do, there'll be one nuclear bomb that drops on you, and if you keep going, how about 2 or 3 or 4? So, Jonathan, tell us, how do you get around that dilemma?
Well, those are the toughest questions, for sure. In the first place, as I say, the actual guts, the nuts and bolts of an abolition agreement can't be anything but an agreement on where both stand in technical terms. So the starting line is the same. Now, I'm prepared to admit that if you have a major state, formerly nuclear state, such as Russia, or as the Soviet Union was, if we speak of Stalin, that seeks to break out, then probably the only repulse is to break out yourself. And I think that an abolition agreement, such as proposed by Global Zero, does actually depend on the readiness of those great powers to do it. I don't think that there's any magical Rube Goldberg machine that enforces the treaty upon a major nuclear power. So you have to make a kind of judgment, a political judgment, to begin with, that's where you are, and that these powers are sincere in that. Then, otherwise, you get into these very subtle questions of timing. In other words, and evaluating how much is it worthwhile for a power to gain a nuclear advantage for, let's say, a period of a month or 2 months, or whatever would have been decided in the light of political suspicions, in the light of political realities. I think if you look into that question, and I don't want to go on too long in trying to answer you, but it turns out that it's worth a lot less in that time period that you might be facing than would seem at first blush when people say that in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and so forth.
Undoubtedly, you've engaged in this argument too. So what would you say about the general topic?
One of the facts to date, of course, is that no nation has been able to develop weapons-grade materials without detection by intelligence agencies since 1945, to date. The other is that, for example, the Global Zero Plan encompasses, as does any reasonable plan, verification, safeguards, intrusive inspections, which is also part of the START Treaty, and one of the arguments that's being made by many, because as the START Treaty lapsed on the 1st of December, since that time, many are concerned that there has been no inspection of the Russian arsenals, and vice versa. But the point is that there are a variety of steps that would form a part of an agreement that include a very intrusive set of safeguards and verification procedures. And the other, as I said, fact that I'm not sure if perhaps in the future that can be somehow worked around, but to date there has been no manufacture of weapons-grade material without detection by another state. So you're not talking about a few months after a weapon goes off. You're talking about a period of time after the detection of the process starting to create weapons-grade material. That's maybe a smaller time frame, at least to date it is.
No, exactly. And I think that there's great reassurance to be had in the record of inspection. We can think of Iraq after the first Gulf War and other examples, but it's been rather encouraging.
And I think that the record of the IAEA in its inspection of the places that it's allowed to inspect is outstanding. And actually, its record about what was the reality on the ground in Iraq before the 2003 invasion turned out to be a whole lot better than American intelligence judgment. But let me take one more angle, and then we're going to get some questions from the audience, where I think you're supposed to be filling out a card if you have one, and they'll collect them and bring them in. But Queen Noor, you get a chance to see this from a non-American perspective, even though you're, I guess, a former American, or you were
in my heart.
You were born in America, and you're extremely American-friendly and come from a country that's American-friendly, but still are able to look a little bit outside. And Americans are so preoccupied with ourselves and our view of the world and how things are. So, what do Americans mostly miss about this topic? That from an international perspective seems odd.
Well, I think because I had the luxury of growing up and being educated in this country, it became easy to consider myself a citizen of the world once I'd lived and worked in other countries, without that in any way diminishing my attachment to this country or Jordan or any other. I feel that what is missed, a lot of it, is in the film Countdown to Zero, actually. And that was the reason for creating it, and also you both have described it as being making the reality of this, the current state of affairs, and also the history that has taken us to this point, very accessible to any audience. I think that one of the areas that is not discussed, that is extremely important in the larger international community when looking at this subject and looking at the tensions that have been increasing in terms of rhetoric and international discourse over proliferation in particular, is the fact that much of the international community views the nuclear states' positions, if you will, to date as having been a position of setting double standards. And really from the start, actually. But certainly today, that is a very important issue that needs to be tackled, and why Global Zero, or at least an international multilateral framework that brings together the nuclear states, that needs to be preceded by U.S. The New START Treaty, and then another commitment to cuts by the United States and Russia, because they have 96%, 90-something% of all the nuclear weapons out there right now. That needs to be preceded by those another stage of cuts, and then you have a chance of setting up a multilateral process that will bring in most, if not eventually, God willing, all of the other nuclear states. And it's critical that that process leads to a commitment to a set of requirements and responsibilities and standards that apply to everyone equally. And then I think you have a dynamic, you begin to have a dynamic in place that will create very clear outliers if all nuclear states do not come on board, and if proliferation continues when all nuclear states have agreed to the goal of zero. I may not have articulated that very well, but the double standard is a very important issue that resonates around the world, that is never discussed in this country, and yet is critical when you're looking at countries like Iran, or looking at North Korea, or looking at India and Pakistan and Israel, or looking at any potential new nuclear state.
No, I think that's absolutely a key thing, and it's why I'm very much in favor of an absolutely firm and highly articulated commitment to a world without nuclear weapons as an immediate factor in the non-proliferation effort. Because nuclear powers that have decided seriously and believably to do without nuclear weapons themselves are going to be much more committed and much more persuasive in arguing, pressuring, what have you, other states into either rolling back their own arsenals or rolling back their nuclear programs or not heading down that path. So I think that the commitment, I like to say that I'm in favor of a front-loaded approach. Right now we have a sort of let's take a step and then wait and see what the next step would be. But I think that we're foregoing a tremendous force for non-proliferation by taking that gradual approach.
Well, Queen Noor, you underlined the double standard proposition. I have, on a couple of occasions, when when serving in the U.S. government, found myself trying to explain why nuclear weapons are good for the U.S. and bad for somebody else. Now, of course, there's about 11 good reasons, but if you're not a diplomat, conveying them without smiling is difficult. So I think there's no question that there's that dimension of the issue. I think there's another question that I wanted to raise, which is if without nuclear weapons, so let's imagine a world without nuclear weapons, but big military asymmetries. So there's big strong states and there's little weak states. And imagine the big strong states from time to time decide that what a little smaller state is doing, they don't like. They don't like this person ruling it, or they don't like their human rights record, or they don't like their seeming to be threatening. But in any case, they decide, no, you shouldn't rule your country anymore. We should topple you and make you over and to be a different kind of country. So now if I'm the leader of a small, weaker country, don't nuclear weapons look like a security blanket or an equalizer that might lead you not to come and attack me? I mean, to put a point on it, imagine Saddam Hussein had a nuclear arsenal. Would the U.S. have attacked him and toppled him in 2003? And hadn't this question at least been thought of by somebody like Kim Jong-il in Korea, and maybe even by the mullahs in Tehran? So if without nuclear weapons I can come and destroy you or your regime, are you going to be happy to be without that potential security just because I've said I'm forswearing nuclear weapons?
I'll comment on that. I'll make a factual point.
Okay.
We do live in such a world right now. In other words, we have countries that not only have nuclear weapons, conventional superiority, but also have nuclear weapons. And yet, as a factual matter, there are 184, I think it is now, countries in the world that have nonetheless agreed not to offset those advantages by getting a nuclear capability under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So however they figure it, this problem doesn't seem to, as a factual matter, to be a very great one. So yes, there certainly would be a handful of countries that would be thinking in the way of little countries. North Korea and Iran come immediately to mind, that would be thinking in the way you suggest. But you'd have to work out some security arrangement with them where you would agree not to attack them.
And Iran has committed to a weapons of mass destruction free, larger Middle East zone. It has committed to that. And various ayatollahs have come out and said these are weapons of genocide. They are taboo in Islam. But it's back to the point that you were making before of if you have an international norm that is committed to by the nuclear states, and you are moving towards zero in a proportionate and equitable, if you will, fashion, then you will be able to mobilize what is not possible now, much more likely an international consensus to target anyone who breaks out or who resists joining what has become an international norm binding everyone to the same obligations. So I think that that's part of what another asset to the process is. Right now you cannot galvanize international consensus on those states that are potential proliferators because there are these double standards at play and there is no international consensus. But as you said, I think it's 187 states, possibly.
Is it now?
And there are states who have given up their nuclear weapons programs, such as South Africa, who had an established nuclear weapons program. It's proven it can be done. And there are states in Latin America who were on their way and could have, and met together and agreed to pull back and to commit to a weapons of mass, nuclear-free zone in Latin America. If only India and Pakistan might see their way to that. But there are examples and precedents.
Well, just to underline, because for people that don't follow it as a technical matter, there is, when I give my little quiz for students at school, how many states had nuclear weapons and eliminated them? Well, one for sure made 6 nuclear bombs itself and eliminated 6 nuclear bombs. That's South Africa. And then 3 other states, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, had superpower nuclear arsenals when the Soviet Union disappeared, and those have all been zeroed out. So this is not an inconceivable thing. The second point you made, which is also extremely important fact, how many states have started down the path seriously to nuclear weapons and stopped before they got there or backed up? And the answer is twice as many as who finally got nuclear weapons. And those include Brazil, but also Sweden and Italy. So quite a number of states. So that, again, it's not inconceivable.
The smart states.
Okay. Could be. Let me go to questions from the audience. And so what I'm going to do is simply read the question, and then we'll see who wants to answer. Given broad, tacit public support for New START, it appears that the primary motivation of opposing Republican senators is the lack of political costs. How would you suggest enhancing public awareness to ensure senators are conscious of the political costs and therefore respond to this public interest?
In the lame duck session?
Yes.
That's for you.
No, for me. No, that's for you, actually. You're the American.
Maybe Graham will compromise and get Graham to answer.
I never wanted to be a politician.
I was at a session last night at the Kennedy School that we had the title of it was Strange Bedfellows. This is our forum events, and it was Jeb Bush, who was the governor of Florida from 1998 to 2000 and, I don't know, 8 or something.
Recently.
So recently, who's been a visiting fellow at the Kennedy School. Michelle Rhee, who's a Kennedy School graduate, who was the chancellor of the D.C. school system, who lost her job when her boss, the mayor, lost his job over the fact that they were making such serious progress in education in D.C. Margaret Spelling, who's a fellow at the school at the IOP, who was Bush 43's Secretary of Education, is a Texas lady, and John Podesta, who was Clinton's chief of staff and who's very interested in education. And somebody asked about in the education arena, how is it that somehow or another a state like Florida, who under Jeb Bush went from being, I don't know, close to the bottom in terms of performance in the high schools and in the grade schools, came to be in the top quartile even, and every year has been getting better, and he didn't get much credit for it. Okay? Or similarly, in the D.C. case, in 2 years, they had changed things just hugely, dramatically, but didn't get a lot of public credit for it. And the argument, and Michelle Rhee, this is her line, she said, and how are you going to get then politicians now to act on this basis, particularly since it's not one where sensible Republicans and sensible Democrats have a difference of view. This panel was about 90%, it seemed to me, to be agreed among themselves. And so Michelle Rhee said, well, look, if on the one hand you have do-gooders from the Kennedy School who have good arguments and go to Senator Jones and say, here are the 7 good arguments why you should do this in the public interest. And on the other hand, an organized group comes and says, we will give you money and workers for your campaign. Which one does the senator follow? So I would say that's a question. Yeah.
It is a question. It's why we produce the film. It's why meetings like this are important. One of our partners is the History Channel with Countdown to Zero, which is also going to get the message out. What you do in this narrow time frame of the lame duck session, I don't know, except that I think there's a lot that can be done. And it needs people like both of you and others who are experts just to flood Washington, I think, and just make this argument, and the airwaves, because this is an issue that I don't think has yet been decided, that there's tending to be a kind of pessimism about whether or not the Senate will pass this treaty, or whether or not they'll be able to bring it up with the votes that are necessary. On the other hand, there are those who feel that there is the possibility there, because there is the U.S. military leadership supports this. As you mentioned, all the political leaders of both parties, that there is no logical reason at all why, and there's every reason for supporting this treaty. So it will just be that worst side of American politics if it doesn't come up and be voted on.
But if you go back to Michelle's point, I think if I were a senator.
Oh, you want them to be bribed?
No, and if I were a senator and I thought that by not voting for something that the great majority of my constituents wanted, this would be, I would be in jeopardy. Exactly. I think this would impact my thinking about this. So I think there may be something more concrete that citizens can do in terms of communicating their view that this is an extremely important, I'm not a single issue voter, but this is an extremely important issue about which the national security establishment is virtually unanimous. So there's not like a strong argument on the substantive grounds. So for this to get stuck in the politics, I think it's really shameful.
If there were an NRA for this issue, START would have been passed months ago.
There's a good idea.
Well, Global Zero, maybe.
We're trying.
Did
anyone see Jon Stewart last night? No. It was pretty funny.
What did he do last night?
Well, he did something on he was taking the mickey out of Fox News and their attacks on George Soros, and he brought in Rupert Murdoch, and he had chalkboards, and he had all the puppets, and he had all the paraphernalia of Glenn Beck, targeting George Soros. So it came to mind as we were talking, because the accusations are that there are these puppet masters that have resources and have media control who are able to do exactly what we're talking about.
Well, we should get a puppet master.
But I would imagine I know there are a great many people who are really committed to this, but it's going to be a very complex process. But I don't think we should give up. And I would ask our audience, any one of you that can have any impact on any group or individual or political decision maker, to please engage, because one person. We were talking earlier about the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin before we came out on stage, and the impact that one person can have, or the loss of one person, and I would add my husband to the mix as well, can have on the direction in which critical events go that have an impact can have an impact for generations. And I would say that every one of you in this audience should consider themselves assume that responsibility that President Kennedy advocated so beautifully. That ask what you can do, because everyone can do something, and sometimes it can be the thing that tips the
balance.
The balance.
Good.
Here.
Another question from the audience. The questioner says, I think the reason for the entrenchment of the nuclear arsenal, the question that was being discussed, is fear. Each country fears to be the first to get rid of its nuclear weapons because of the lack of trust that the other countries will follow suit. Doesn't the U.S., by refusing to ratify the New START treaty, reinforce that fear?
Yeah, I think it's... Maybe I should make that the shortest answer of the evening.
It reinforces all the worst aspects of a political system, of a country that should be a leader in the world, and plays to the worst forces, the most dangerous forces at play in this larger issue.
Yeah, if you remember, and I know I have to remind myself every now and then what a nuclear weapon really is and what these things do. And if you recall that there's no city on Earth that can't be leveled by a nuclear weapon of the appropriate size, with all the people killed, the hundreds of thousands, even millions of people killed and casualties. If you introduce such an instrument into the relationship between countries, then you have a cycle of fear, just to elaborate a little, such as you get from nothing else. And so I think the question is a very deep one, and we are in the grip of fear. And I think that does go a long way to explaining why we can't dig ourselves out, because the very fact of these horrible, horrible instruments, their very presence, even when we're not thinking about it, even when the public is indifferent, we kind of know that we're under the mushroom cloud. And it seems to be independent even of political quarrels. It seems the political quarrels can come and go, and that fear persists and causes us each to clutch onto our nuclear weapon.
But is this a question of fear with New START, or is this a question of domestic politics, as it is a question in a number of other nuclear states? Which is it? Are these senators afraid? Have they not had access to all of the rational arguments that are being made by the military,
I think
being
they
made
play
by the
to
experts.
fear. They
They
play
play
to
to
fear.
fear. They play to fear. But this is domestic politics and lack of statesmanship.
I think it is.
And this is traditionally a bipartisan issue.
Yeah. But if something is a matter simply of domestic politics, and if the citizens who are required to vote for me have a very strong view and express it,
that's our
maybe
job,
I'll
though.
change my
Our job is to make it a strong point of view.
my position.
It's not yet passionate.
Right.
That's the problem. There should be much more passion out there about this issue.
Here's a question about nuclear terrorism. So
that's for you.
Well, no, but an interesting angle. So the questioner says a main obstacle to eliminating the threat of nuclear terrorism is stopping the smuggling of illicit nuclear materials, what the Queen had referred to earlier. All of the disruptions of smuggling have essentially been locked. And actually in the film, Rolf Boet-Larsen, who was the chief intelligence searcher for this, makes the point that in every case in which nuclear weapons usable material has been intercepted, it had not been reported missing. Every case, okay? So what can the international community do to address this issue? If we can't stop smuggling of marijuana from Mexico, what can we do to improve the likelihood that we would stop nuclear smuggling?
Drain the swamp.
Since you've written a whole book on this, I'm reluctant to turn it over to you. But I think you should answer.
Well, my short answer would be that the likelihood of a country like the U.S., as open as we are, preventing terrorists smuggling a nuclear bomb successfully to an American city, if terrorists get a nuclear bomb, is pretty low. And we should work hard, and it's good to have higher fences and more barriers and more complications, but if we know for sure that drugs come to our cities, if we know for sure that people come illegally into the country, all of the trails that along which drugs come to a city are the same trails that could be used in bringing a nuclear bomb to a city. So as Sam Nunn likes to say, every mile away from the source gets easier for the terrorists and harder for the defenders. So the point is then at the source that all nuclear weapons, all nuclear materials should be locked down to a gold standard, which was the focus of this nuclear security summit. Now, if it were ultimately eliminated so that there were no nuclear materials, then there would be no nuclear terrorism.
That's another component, by the way, of Global Zero and other plans, which is that we haven't talked about the internationalizing the fuel cycle so that you don't have nuclear materials spread as widely as you might have civilian nuclear power facilities in the world, but you have an internationalization of that critical fuel cycle, which again is an extra level of safeguards.
Yeah, the path to a nuclear weapon-free world, and tell me if you agree, Graham, exactly parallels the path to stopping the threat of terrorist use of nuclear weapons.
I think that if one, in the Sam Nunn metaphor, so yes, I think Sam Nunn has a good metaphor in which he says, for those who find the idea of a world free of nuclear weapons still a little far-fetched, and I would say that includes me. I'm a doubting Thomas supporter. Okay, so he says, well, here, let me explain to you how you can think about it, and I like this metaphor a lot, and he uses it as a way to help audiences understand. So the zero is like the top of a mountain. And from the valley where we are now, seeing the top of the mountain, it's pretty hazy. You got to get up, there's clouds and there's various, mountain ranges. So it's quite a stretch. But you have an idea which the direction is. And so the task is to start working your way to the base camps, So a base camp that gets you from where we are now to, for example, all nuclear weapons and materials that exist locked up as good as gold is not the end of the journey. But if you fail to get there, so after a nuclear bomb or two has gone off in various cities, you're going to be in a world so chaotic, hard to tell how you would ever get to the top. So the proposition is, we have a pretty, I think, almost unanimous for people that try to work the security side of the issues, concept of where we need to be going, which is a stretch. And when you get to a base camp, as you do when you're climbing mountains, all of a sudden you look up and you think, wow, look at that. There's a peak up there that I couldn't see very clearly from lower. Here's another question from the audience. It says, who profits from the proliferation of nuclear weapons?
Good question. Very good question.
Okay. What about the corporations or individuals who profit from them? And we were chatting a little bit about that before, so what about that?
Well, you know, all weapon systems have profits attached and corporations that make those profits. And if there's no countervailing force, those pressures will prevail. It's kind of business as usual. But these are not unbeatable pressures. And in fact, we've seen that there's the arsenals of the United States and Russia actually have been cut by more than a half since the height of the Cold War, since their height in the Cold War. And so as far as financial pressures are concerned, that alone shows you that these can be defeated by political will, with political will.
I like that answer.
Earlier we were chatting a little bit about Mr. A.Q. Khan, who was the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb program, but then whom in the good line from Mohammed al-Baradei, set up the Walmart of nuclear proliferation. So here's a fellow who built the Pakistani nuclear bomb program, built nuclear bombs, is a hero in Pakistan, who simultaneously was the world's first nuclear black marketeer, selling nuclear weapons and materials to buyers everywhere. So to Libya, to Iran, to North Korea, was a not infrequent visitor to Saudi. So if you look at his travel itinerary, quite remarkable. And he amassed a quite substantial fortune for himself. I think he had 17 palatial houses, various parts of the world, by the time he was finally apprehended. So what about that dimension?
Well, why was he a hero in Pakistan? Because the United States, and some would say because the United States did not share nuclear technology with Russia in the 1940s and then come to a mutual agreement not to use it, but that's a moot point. But the United States and Russia started along their trail. Then China felt that it had, I don't know if China came before France and Great Britain, but they were slightly after. Then China entered for obvious reasons. I mean, you can understand they felt that they'd better be a nuclear power as the other powers that were felt this was necessary for their security. Then India felt if China had the weapon, it needed to acquire the weapon because there were tensions, long-standing tensions between India and China. And then Pakistan in 1974 decided, well, if India has the weapon, then we must get the weapon. That is why he's a hero in Pakistan, because for the Pakistanis, the weapon became an iconic symbol of national pride and an instrument of security, of defensive security, so to speak. And that is how they arrived at that crazy point. That's just my answer to the question.
I think that's a good answer, and I think, unfortunately, that's another dynamic of the issue that's got to be taken into account. But unfortunately, it's my responsibility as the moderator to say that we've come to the witching hour. So let me not try to summarize, but simply to say this film, Countdown to Zero, I think this group at least strongly agrees is a good introduction to the topic for those that want to go a little further. And it'll be on the DVD.
November 23rd. And these two gentlemen have written some extraordinary books about this subject that are also,
we'd be
like
happy
the film,
happy
wonderful.
to sell books as well, but there'll be actually a discussion of this with highlights of the film done at the Kennedy School Forum on December 1st. And Valerie Plame, the former CIA agent who was who served as the moderator thing, will be there for discussion. If those of you want to, I would say spring for the price of the DVD, but if you don't want to, come to the Kennedy School the 1st of December. But on behalf of the library and the audience, I want to say what an honor it's been to be part of a panel with Queen Noor and how much we admire her taking her time, energy, and imagination to devote to this topic, and to say to Jonathan that we've enjoyed being part of the panel. So thank you very much.